As someone who's played a variety of different fan games, from super high to super low quality, as well as been making their own over the last 4 years, I thought it'd be fun to make a video talking about the things that actually make them good. The features that make or break whether or not someone wants to play your fan game. I'm going to be splitting them up into 4 different categories: the region, the gameplay, the graphics, and the story. Now keep in mind that these are all my opinions, and you don't have to agree with them, but again, I have played many fan games, and I have spent a lot of time making my own. So I respectfully feel that I have a bit of a better head on my shoulders when talking about them. Let's start with one of the first things you're going to see when you start a Pokemon game, or the first thing you're going to start working on when you make one. That's the region and its routes and towns. A big thing I think about when it comes to maps is it's not so much about making one place look really good, but more about making it feel different from the last one you made, and that last one feeling different from the one you made before. The biggest example I can think of what not to do in region design, and sorry Gen 1ers, is Kanto. The region significantly lacks biome diversity, with 90% of the routes being just the green grass and trees. Which, of course, isn't a bad opening point for your game. Beginning your journey in a grassy green town that leads into a route of similar nature, possibly followed by a forest, is a comfortable start that even after playing hundreds of fan games, I still won't get bored of. But after doing that for a few maps, you should probably start switching it up. Whether it be a desert, a mountain, a snowy forest, or even a swamp, you as a player definitely want a change of pace in your adventure. And as a developer, mapping the same biome over and over again can feel quite draining. And when you're drained, the quality of your work goes down. Trust me, when a player opens the region map and sees the different biomes they're going to be able to explore, it certainly gives them more motivation to continue playing. Speaking of the region map, the best ones are usually those that don't feel like you're walking in a straight line. Fan games like Xenoverse and Insurgents, in my opinion, feel kind of boring to progress through, since their regions are for the most part incredibly linear. That feeling you get when you encounter a path blocked by a body of water or small trees, only to be able later to return with the tools to progress through it, is one that fills you with a sense of accomplishment. You're now able to look back on where you were when you first saw that roadblock, and understand just how far you've come in your adventure. Finally, I wanted to talk about towns and cities. Something I've noticed in a couple of fan games is having the player travel through a town with nothing really to do there. Obviously, it's a good place to stop and heal your Pokemon, but you could always just have a Pokemon Center in the middle of a route to solve that problem. Towns should always have something to do, whether it be a gym leader, a special shop, or even a sizable event that ties in with the game's story, lore, or characters. Gameplay is a very broad subject, so much so that the last segment could even count towards it. So I'm going to sort of break it down into a few points, starting with difficulty. Difficulty has always been a touchy subject, with the skill level of the community ranging very far, between people who need switch mode and items in battle to get through fights in the mainline games, to people who nuzlocke the hardest ROM hacks for fun. And you obviously shouldn't be ashamed of yourself for not being good at Pokemon. These are single player games, and the thing that you should put first is how much fun you're going to have, rather than how much better you are than someone else. On the contrary, however, fan game developers should not feel the need to cater to these audiences over their own desires. But the first thing I actually want to talk about when it comes to difficulty is something called reverse difficulty. I'm sure just about every person watching has played one of those enhancement hacks where the first gym leader faces you with 6 Pokemon, each layered with a full set of coverage moves. Of course, going into a difficulty hack, this can be expected, but a lot of the time, after this first gym battle, the game just gets easier. And it's not because the battles themselves are getting easier. In fact, on paper, they're usually getting a bit harder. But what I feel a lot of creators sometimes don't take into account is as the game progresses, the player gets access to evolved Pokemon, stronger moves, TMs, breeding, EV tradings, and so much stuff that makes the game so much easier on our end. So I believe the best way to handle difficulty is to worry less about how hard your battles are on paper, but rather think about what tools your players have access to at that given point. It's also okay if players don't struggle with the first or second gym, because if the first gym feels like a battle for life or death, then everything after is going to have to live up to that. But then again, a game doesn't necessarily need to be difficult to be good. Some people might just want a casual and laid back experience, and that's okay. If I pick up a really cool looking game and find it to be too easy, I'll probably just nuzlocke it. But one thing I think should be included in any fan game, no matter what the difficulty level, is a decent battle AI. Now don't worry, if you're a new developer, there are a good number of public battle AI scripts and plugins to use. But the reason why this is important is because no matter how hard or how easy your boss battle is, when they spam a random status move or an effective attacking move over and over again, it just feels so boring. Next up is pacing. Surprisingly, almost every fan game I've played, especially the newer ones, are paced pretty well from start to finish. But I still wanted to talk about it because I feel like there are some games where you progress way too quickly. This can kinda tie into what I ended the region segment with, how your towns and cities should always have something to do, because having events between your game's gym leaders, or whatever similar milestone you're using, is what separates an adventure game from a boss rush. This could be anything from a simple rival battle, or having to venture into a cave, forest, or building that doesn't lead right down the main path. Another important thing to consider is the level curve. While this isn't a problem that plagues many new fan games, it was very prevalent in the older ones. Obviously, no one wants to mimic Johto's curve of arriving at the Pokemon League with level 39 Pokemon, but your gym leader shouldn't jump 11 levels from the last when the only thing between the two is a few routes, especially in the late game. Your first gym leader also doesn't need to have level 25 Pokemon. I think that the best way to get a good level curve is to test it with multiple people and or playstyles. But if you don't want to go through the effort of doing all that, you could always just use level caps and give the player a ton of free EXP. I know a lot of gamers say that graphics don't matter, but I kind of disagree. But also not in the way you might think. When people are looking for a new Pokemon fan game to play, there's one very big determining factor that decides whether or not it'll be yours. And those are the screenshots, or the graphics. And to me, it's not really about what kind of graphic or art style you use, but how you apply them. For example, this nostalgic town from Fire Red and Leaf Green looks pretty plain, but when we add some additional tiles to spice it up, it starts to look a little bit better, but it can still be improved. So let's borrow a tile set from the massive collection of free-to-use with credit pre-formatted tile sets, put it into the game, and after a few minutes of work, yeah, that looks way better than before. And this is something I don't think a lot of devs understand. You don't need to make custom tiles for your game to look good, nor do you need to spend hours on every map so it looks something like this. Simply adding a new tile set really emphasizes the excitement you want the player to feel when they explore the new or updated region in your game. Another thing that bothers me graphically is open space. Looking at this map from an aerial view, it looks fine, but once you actually traverse it from the perspective of a player, yeah, it feels like it's missing something. You could just throw an NPC there and call it a day, but if you want to make your town more lively, I would add some trees, grass, or even a small park. While I mostly see these kinds of maps in screenshots from new developers, this lack of detail even plagues some of the more popular fan games, like Insurgents for example. It's something a lot of developers overlook, which is really a shame, because just throwing some extra rocks, trees, or even grass around your map really makes a difference. Every corner of every town or route should have something nice to look at. Finally, I feel like this goes without saying, but then again, games like this exist. Don't mash together art styles. If you pick a style, try your best to stick to it, especially when it comes to NPCs. I made this mistake myself when I was a new developer, and it took a lot of time to eventually fix. I thought I'd make the last segment about something I think a lot of players tend to overvalue in Pokemon fan games, and that's storytelling. Whenever I see someone asking for a new Pokemon game to play, one of the things they usually ask for is a good story. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't think the quality of the writing in a fan game really matters that much. Instead, it's about how that writing is adapted into the game and how much it chooses to limit the player. For example, one of my favorite fan games, Reborn, has a story that I've never really been able to enjoy. But with the speed up button, combined with the text skip feature, I can just ignore it and continue to enjoy the gameplay. Of course, this isn't something I suggest new players do. I think you should give the story a try, despite what me and other people say. Honestly, I haven't found too many fan games or ROM hacks with writing that has kept me intrigued. At the same time, if the gameplay is still fun, I'm probably going to stick around. However, I think the worst thing a developer can do is try to force the player to read their story. The most common and really only way I've seen this done is by restricting speed up. Now I know the speed up button is a very controversial topic among developers, with some not wanting to include it so that players take more time with the game they worked very hard on, which in some cases doesn't really bother me. An example would be Pokemon Flux, where despite it not having speed up, there are a ton of pretty details to look at, and the game isn't very plot heavy. On the contrary, the lack of fast forward in Xenoverse made the game a really miserable experience for me. I found the game's story to be very boring, and sitting through its enormous number of cutscenes made it really hard to keep playing. So does all of this mean that you should just avoid writing a story if you don't think you can write a good one? Absolutely not. Like I said, bad or uninteresting writing is fine as long as you don't lock the player into reading it all with features like anti-speed up. But a piece of advice I have for anyone who wants to write a story-focused fan game is to not focus only on the story, because I have played a few games with good writing that just feel like a chore to continue because of how boring the gameplay was. At the end of the day, you don't have to agree with everything I said here. What you find fun or desirable in a Pokemon game might be completely different from what myself or others would. I just hope that I was able to get my points across in a way you guys found entertaining, and some newer devs found educational. But if you're a fan of Pokemon fan games and ROM hacks, then be sure to subscribe so I can continue making videos about them. I hope you all have a nice rest of your day, and goodbye!